The 2025 NFL Draft is flooded with many wide receiver prospects, so in today's video, I want to talk about a couple of those big-time prospects, as well as talk about which NFL teams should potentially be interested in drafting one of these wide receivers. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, but let's go ahead and hop right into it. So as I mentioned, we are going to begin by talking about each individual prospect. We're only going to talk about guys who could potentially go in the first and second round, so obviously if I miss a guy, then maybe he won't go as high right now, but I will say we still have a long ways to the NFL draft, so they always have a chance to move up, at least in the draft boards. I would say my number one prospect for this upcoming draft is Travis Hunter from Colorado. Now, the unique thing about Travis Hunter is we actually don't know what position he's actually going to play. He plays both cornerback and wide receiver for the Colorado Buffaloes. And even though I think there's a lot of teams that would love to utilize his ability as a quarterback, I could also see a world where he potentially decides to go all in on being a wide receiver. I think that is the biggest reason why he is my number one current prospect, is just sort of the raw talent to be able to play two positions at once, which gives a team that potentially needs both positions a lot of flexibility to use that draft pick. For Travis Hunter as a pure receiver, I don't think he's the best overall prospect. When you're talking about somebody who's just an absolute weapon, I think Travis Hunter is by far the best. He's got a good combination of size. He's got a good combination of speed, hands, agility, run after catch. I think his route running is pretty dang solid. Again, as a pure wide receiver, I would probably say he's probably my third wide receiver on this list, but I do think regardless, if he were to go in as a wide receiver in the upcoming draft, I think he would easily be a top 15-ish level pick. If he goes as a corner, probably a top 10 pick. However, at number 2, and I apologize if I say this name wrong, Tetaroa McMillan out of Arizona. Now, unfortunately for Arizona, this season has not been the season that they thought they were going to have, but it is really not in any part due to McMillan's play. He's been playing at a very high level. We're talking about a guy who has great size, around 6'5", probably around 215-ish pounds. He's got good size, he's got good speed. I think his route running is extremely good, especially for his overall size. And I think given the fact that he's around 6'4", 6'5", I think he's pretty damn fast. This is a pure wide receiver 1 level prospect. Again, as I mentioned with Travis Hunter, I think this would easily be the best overall receiver prospect, but just as a prospect in general, he'll be number 2 on this video. I think McMillan fits a bunch of NFL team needs. He is the prototypical wide receiver 1. He's going to be extremely dominant at the NFL level, and I think that he's going to be a great player. Next up at number 3, we have Trey Harris out of Ole Miss. Now, this is a bit of a recent riser, at least in this NFL draft. He wasn't somebody who was getting much buzz early on, at least first round buzz, but lately has been getting a ton of buzz, and I think it's for pretty good reason. For starters, he has a very solid frame and size. He sits at around 6'2", and obviously he goes to Ole Miss. Ole Miss is notorious for having good sized wide receiver, and I would say that Trey Harris is a follow suit of what they've been doing. This guy is a red zone monster. His ability to box out defenders, his route running within the red zone is always pretty solid, and he's just an absolute demon down there. While he isn't somebody who's going to generate a bunch of separations on his route running, he doesn't really need to do it all that much because he's got very strong hands, and typically when you just give him an opportunity, he's going to come down with it. He kind of reminds me a little bit of like a Rome Odunze. Not perfect comparisons. Rome Odunze was somebody who didn't get a bunch of separation, but you didn't really have to worry about that because he was so good at just using his abilities, and that's kind of what I get out of Trey Harris. However, at my number 4 spot is Luther Burden. I think Luther Burden is somebody who's kind of fallen down draft boards a little bit, and that's just been really because of how bad Missouri has been offensively this year. And I think in some ways Luther Burden could play better, but I don't want to put a bunch of the blame on him. That team has had a bunch of other issues outside of his control. However, for Luther Burden, I think he's one of the better athletes in this draft. He's a twitchy athlete who has good generation with his speed. I think his size is fairly well at around 5'11", around 180 to 200 pounds. This is somebody who you want to get the ball out in space because he's an absolute monster with yards after catch. He's a really good athlete, as I mentioned earlier, very fast. Again, doesn't really have the size of some of the other guys we've talked about, but when you're talking about somebody who could play on the inside or the outside, I think you obviously would like to have somebody a little bit bigger, but 5'11", I think he plays very well with his size. This is also somebody who I don't really think I'm going to talk about this too much in this video, but this is somebody who's actually a really good run blocker. So if you're talking about a guy who wants to fit in a certain system, aka like a Detroit Lions, I think that he'd be a really good fit for them. Again, this season hasn't been particularly pretty for him, but I don't really think it's all that much of his fault. I think this is a special athlete with a special talent and given ability. I just don't think he's been given the opportunity to prove that this year with Missouri. But at number 5, I have Isaiah Bond out of Texas, originally from Alabama. This year hasn't been pretty and amazing for Isaiah Bond. He has some injury issues these past couple weeks and hasn't been as productive as I really would have liked to have seen from him in his junior year. However, this guy is a legit burner. This is a guy who is a track and field level athlete. He doesn't have the size, and he's kind of similar in a lot of ways to Luther Burden. He's just a little bit worse than Luther Burden. I think Burden's a bit better of a route runner. I think he also has better hands. But I will say I think that Isaiah Bond might be the best athlete of this wide receiver draft class. This is a guy who is a big-time playmaker. He's also pretty solid with yards after catch. He hasn't really shown that ability too much at Texas, but I think he does have that ability, and if you were to give him a screen, he could easily take that thing 100 yards if you really want him to. Again, this is a guy who you're going to take if you just really want an amazing athlete. I don't think he's going to be a wide receiver 1 level guy in the NFL, but if you want to talk about a great wide receiver 2 prospect, I think that Isaiah Bond is probably your guy. Then we're just going to run through the rest of the names that I think are at least honorable mentions to be within the top 5. Guys like Emeka Egbuka, I'm just not very high on Emeka. I think he's a great player, round 1, round 2 level prospect, but there are some people who have him as high as their number 2 prospect, which I just don't have. But I will say with Emeka, he's got very good size, around 6'1", maybe 200-ish pounds. Somebody who could play on the inside and on the outside. I think he's a good player. Then you got Ty Felton out of Maryland, 6'2", a little bit skinny, but he does have a skill set that I think can definitely translate to the NFL level. He's one of the better route runners in this year's draft. He just needs to put on a little bit more size because currently, as I'm making the video, he's a little bit small. Some other names are guys like Evan Stewart out of Oregon. He's another one of those shorter-ish guys who's a little bit more of a track athlete, but isn't as good as Bond or Luther Burden. Jalen Royals is also a very good prospect, as well as Xavier Restrepo. I'm excited to see what he could do. He just had a pretty good game for Miami. Those are just a couple of the names. Obviously, there's around 8 to maybe even 10 guys who potentially could go within the first 2 rounds, but let's go ahead and go through every NFL team that I think could be interested in taking one of these wide receiver prospects. The way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to go through each individual division and pluck out one team within the division that I think could take a receiver. And we are going to begin with the AFC East. And within the AFC East, I think the team that needs a receiver the most is probably the New England Patriots. For New England, you really just are going to want to get a guy who's going to be with Drake May for probably and hopefully the rest of his career. They're going to be in a position where they could easily take one of their top prospects. So I'm just going to take the best overall receiver prospect, and I'm going to go ahead and think that New England should look after Tetairoa McMillan, a big body, physical wide receiver that is also a really solid athlete. I think he'd be a fantastic fit alongside Drake May, but I think he'd just be overall a very solid fit and somebody who you'd want to have alongside Drake May for the foreseeable future. Buffalo could also be a team that potentially is interested in a receiver. We'll see what happens with Amari Cooper in the offseason, but if they were to go after a wide receiver, I don't think they necessarily need a big-time prospect, but somebody like maybe an Isaiah Bond or a Luther Burden alongside Keon Coleman could be pretty fun. Then in the AFC North, I think there's a couple teams that could use a wide receiver, but I'm going to prioritize the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, you already have George Pickens on the outside, and you do have Roman Wilson, but we haven't seen him this year, so that's kind of an interesting one. Ideally, in this world, if I already have my slot receiver position filled up with Roman Wilson and I have my outside receiver, my big physical big body guy in George Pickens, I want somebody alongside him who's a bit more of a burner, and I think Luther Burden is a fantastic fit for Pittsburgh. Again, this team doesn't really need a big physical wide receiver that can make big splashy plays. Hell, they might have the splashiest wide receiver in the NFL. So going out there and getting somebody who could be sort of like your Jordan Addison to Justin Jefferson, I think Luther Burden would be a fantastic fit for Pittsburgh. Cleveland could also use a wide receiver. I kind of think they have a lot of other positions they should target, but with Cleveland looking like a bad team, I think Travis Hunter would be amazing for that team. Then in the AFC South, I don't think any of these teams are particularly desperate for wide receivers, but I think Tennessee of all these teams might be the most interested in a receiver. This is a Tennessee team that just has a bunch of issues. I think they personally need to look at getting a new quarterback. They obviously have a lot of other holes too, but if they were to go the route of getting a wide receiver, obviously they'd have a pretty high draft pick. So I think going out there and getting a big physical AJ Brown-like receiver, which is a bit ironic for this Titans team, would be the way to go. And I think Trey Harris is somebody who has those capabilities. He's not going to be AJ Brown, let's relax there, but he does have some similar qualities. Then there is the AFC West. Now, I think basically every single one of these teams could use a wide receiver. So I'm just going to be really quick on these ones and just kind of tell you who I think would be a good fit. For Kansas City, you obviously just traded for DeAndre Hopkins. You still have Rashee Rice, but those, at least DeAndre Hopkins isn't a long-term answer there. I think going out there and getting a big physical wide receiver would be the way to go. In terms of a prospect, I think Ty Felton could be the best prospect there. He's a little bit lengthy right now, 6'2", but I think you could mold him alongside Rashee Rice, who could be a bit better of an outside receiver. With his route running, I think think it'd be a very solid fit for that Kansas City team. Then there's the LA Chargers. The Chargers are likely going to finish probably around the 20th to 24th draft pick range. So really, you're just probably going to go best overall player. You obviously have Quentin Johnston, you have Ladd McConkey. This actually could be a spot where maybe you prioritize the tight end position. But if you were to go for a receiver, ideally, I'd prefer somebody who's a bit more of a high-level athlete, who could also do a little bit of some things down the field. I don't really know which player I'm leaning towards, but I guess I'll maybe go with like Evan Stewart. I think that'd be a fun fit. Then there's Denver. Obviously, you have Courtland Sutton, but outside of that, you really don't have a reliable guy. And who knows, maybe Courtland Sutton's on a different team next year. With that said, I'm going to work on this one with the assumption that Courtland is there. So if that's the case, I think ideally you'd like somebody who's a bit more of a track burner, a bit more of an athlete. I'll go with like Isaiah Bond, Luther Burden, or somebody along those lines. And then for the Raiders, obviously you have the tight end position set in stone. I don't think they should draft a receiver in round 1, but if a particular player were to fall to them, I don't think it'd be the worst thing in the world. For Las Vegas, you obviously have Jacoby Myers, but you really just need that true wide receiver 1. I think somebody like a Trey Harris or even a Travis Hunter would be a fantastic fit for the Raiders. Again, I think they're probably going to take a quarterback though. Then we move over to the NFC side of things, and we're going to begin with the NFC East. I think that Dallas is probably the team that speaks to me the most as to who should take a wide receiver. Outside of CeeDee Lamb, this team just does not have another wide receiver who I think can generate any separation. By the way, they just traded a 4th round pick for Jonathan Mingo. That's a terrible trade. Now for Dallas, this one's pretty interesting because CeeDee Lamb just does so much for this team in terms of being an outside and an inside wide receiver, somebody who can play on the slot, can play as an X, a Y, a Z, it doesn't matter. He can do it all. So that definitely does make this pick a little bit more interesting. On one hand, you could say, well, maybe we want somebody who's a bit more of a burner, somebody who can stretch the field like a, Evan Stewart, Isaiah Bond, Luther Burden. But on the other hand, this team doesn't really have that 50-50 goal ball winner type of guy outside of CD, and even CD is not particularly great at that. So I think in this situation, I think you would just probably take the best wide receiver prospect available at the time, and I think somebody like a Trey Harris or a Luther Burden would be a really good fit alongside CeeDee Lamb. It's kind of a weird one because of how versatile CD is, but I don't know, just take the best available receiver, and I think that would add a lot to this Cowboys offense. Then we move over to the NFC North, and none of these teams necessarily need a wide receiver badly, but of all the teams that could use a wide receiver 1, I would probably go towards Green Bay, but I will say Detroit could potentially use a new wide receiver 2 with all the issues with Jameson Williams. So if Detroit were to get a receiver, it would probably be a burner type of guy. For Green Bay, ideally, you would like to find a true wide receiver 1, but I don't know if you're going to be able to find one in the back end of the draft. I will say if you could potentially get your hands on somebody like an Xavier Restrepo, who is a bit more of a slot guy, but could be a very productive player next to Jordan Love. I also do like the idea of Jalen Royals, who's a really solid athlete with pretty solid size and frame. I think he'd also be a very solid fit for that Packers team. Again, I don't want to just add another body into that room. I just think they just could use a guy, and I don't think they're going to have a draft pick to get the guy. Then there is the NFC South. Now, I think there's a couple teams that could actually use a receiver. I think Tampa Bay could be in the room to get a guy, depending on what happens with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Carolina, obviously, they could just use whatever talent they could physically get their hands on. For Carolina, Travis Hunter would be fantastic. Emeka Egbuka would also be a good fit if he was in the second round, of course. But I'm going to focus on Tetairoa McMillan for the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, you already have a couple of different prospects in that room, but you want to get a clear-cut number 1 guy, and I think McMillan would be a solid fit for that team. And then there's New Orleans. Now, the future is a bit unclear with this New Orleans team and with Chris Olave primarily. So for New Orleans, I don't know if receiver is necessarily the biggest thing you need, but if you could definitely get your hands on a big-time prospect, I think that'd be a very smart move for that Saints team. I'm kind of thinking like a Trey Harris would be a solid fit there. And then in the NFC West, really nobody needs a wide receiver here. I guess if there was one team that I would say maybe could use one, it would be San Francisco, because I think the future is a little unclear with some of their receiver prospects, but they don't really need a wide receiver, so I'll focus on Arizona here. I think for Arizona, maybe you'd get a flyer, a speedy guy like a Luther Burden, Isaiah Bond, or Evan Stewart to pair alongside Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson. But of course, if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.